It's great to meet you. Thank you so much for taking a minute out today. I appreciate it.
Oh, I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Yes, sir. So before we get into your life of so many things going on, being an author, a podcaster, and mental health, just there's so many things that are happening. I want to know first and foremost, one of probably the biggest shapeshifters in our mental health as a society was living through that pandemic 4.5, 5 years ago now. How
hmm
did living through that time period create waves that you're still feeling now here in 2025?
a large portion of what I work with is trauma. And there was a lot of created trauma, whether real or artificially created by people, just in anticipation of things that either did happen or that they were afraid were going to happen, either which can be a good catalyst for a traumatic experience. And it was a great awakening for some people, and for other people, it was a motivation for them to shut down and disconnect. And so part of the bifurcation that we are experiencing globally with the population is a reflection of how people have responded not just to the pandemic, but how they were oriented anyway. And that was just one of many additional catalysts in order for them to either move forward or to retreat into their perception of self.
So let's get to the heart and soul of the good work that you do. I'm going to do that by putting you in front of a bunch of grade school kids. They're third
Okay.
graders. It's career day. And one of the kids in the back of the room is like, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" How do you answer him?
I help people become aware and be more of who they either are or want to be.
So, what did you want to be when you were a kid? What was your ideal life?
That's a long time ago. Let me think back to that. I was sports oriented. And so as a kid, I was looking for sports, not for the sport itself, but for ego gratification, as most kids are. They want to be accepted and popular and so forth. And so the sports was a means for that. I did have some athletic ability, not to Mahomes' degree, but within the limited framework that I was working, I perceived that that was an avenue to do that.
So, take me back to your childhood. What were these foundational seeds that helped you get into mental health and to help people get to better places in life? How did this road begin for you?
Well, it begins with actually most people that enter a mental health uh, profession in one aspect or another. We have strains in our personal life. I had my family, extended and immediate, had significant difficulties with alcoholism. And fortunately, I had a mother that was very stable and very responsible and uh, recognized that as a potential, major potential hindrance to me. I was an only child. And as um, wisely and protectively as possible, separated me or isolated me from that aspect of immediate and extended family. And so it allowed me to develop without that constant influence, number one, but nevertheless, it that created a void, which allowed me, in retrospect, to be the observer of how that negative influence would have affected me as a child, and so consequently allows me to observe in others that didn't have that opportunity for separation and observational role to see how it has shaped their lives and what aspects of their lives need to be dealt with and resolved so that they can better be them on their own self.
You know, on this path of figuring out what we need to do with our lives, the profession that we decide to get into, there may be a moment or there may be a time period where it's confirmed to us. What moment was it like for you that you knew that this was your calling? This was your path to help people to be in the mental health realm?
Well, actually, it occurred in what is famously referred to as an awakening about my 50th year. So this is actually a second career for
Okay.
me. The majority years wise of my life was spent as most people spend their lives in trying to develop a profession and make money, have a family, that sort of thing. And an awakening is nothing more than a point in your life where you realize that all this stuff, regardless of how successful or unsuccessful you may be, isn't actually bringing you greater happiness. And so from that point, we are tasked with becoming more aware and learning. All of this time that everyone spends in their life trying to be conventionally successful requires that we have awareness pointed outside of you. In other words, I have to observe you, I have to observe my surroundings, I have to make plans and how to interact with the world around us. And it's incumbent upon us at that point of awakening that we learn to invert that same awareness from outside of us to inside of us. And when we do that, is when we begin to effect healing of ourselves and transform our lives to be purposeful rather than successful.
So, who's been kind of an inspiration, a hero for you in your work? Someone that you've looked up to or relied on?
Well, numerous people, and each contributed bits and pieces that have uh, begun to create the puzzle, put the pieces of the puzzle together. Professionally, inspirationally, of course, spiritual leaders like Gandhi and Buddha, Jesus to some degree, Lao Tzu, which gave perspective, but also more less spiritual leaders like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and philosophers that have learned from a more practical, less spiritual standpoint to invert that awareness and become self-aware. Professionally, within the business, some more um, recent devotees would be David Hawkins, who was a psychiatrist and a psychologist and was very proficient and very developed in his understanding of humanity and the human psyche. Um, Carl Jung, of course, is instrumental to most everyone who is successful in the mental health business, and there, the list goes on.
So, let me ask you this. When we speak about human trauma, is there ever a time where we get to a point through therapy and through dealing with it that we can move past it, or is it a lifelong thing, or does it depend on the severity of it?
I have been trained in some methodologies that were created by a Serbian psychologist by the name of Zivorad Slavinsky. And Zivorad's approach to mental health, he was a psychologist, and his approach to mental health was revolutionary in that he essentially disavowed the methodologies and the philosophies of the entire mental health process and approached it from the standpoint of enlightenment. And so his purpose was to, for himself, become more enlightened and consequently be able to offer that to others. And uh, Trauma is a greatly misunderstood concept. It is predicated upon the foundational belief by the mental health industry that our mind is a product of our brain, and that is 180 degrees the way things actually are. Our brain is a product of our mind, and a mind is a product of our spirit. And so, consequently, there's great misunderstanding as how to treat as well as how to diagnose what most of the conditions that people are identified with in the mental health process. Uh, Trauma. Uh, I do this all day, every day. I did it 3 times yesterday to some patients at a mental health facility that I work at still periodically, not consistently. And I get rid of their traumas in less than 10 minutes.
Wow.
And it's transformative when you get rid of their traumas, and they were all diagnosed with PTSD, which essentially characterizes the behaviors that result from a trauma. The trauma is the nucleus, and the PTSD are the behavioral characteristics that people resort to in order to deal with the trauma. But the trauma itself goes away once you get rid of the seed and the problem is gone, then those behavioral characteristics are no longer necessary. And so consequently, you and with the help of a therapist can again put the pieces of the puzzle together and resolve any characteristics of PTSD. These were all veterans that I worked with that I did yesterday, but any source of trauma is essentially the same methodology of how something becomes a trauma. And a
So,
trauma,
yeah, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to explain, a trauma is misunderstood because we misunderstand how the mind functions.
Yeah.
As humans, we are obligated. We can only process one thought at a time. And regardless of how multitask oriented that you are simply processing one thought at a time, but you may be jumping from topic to topic. And so consequently, we are obligated to make a decision about every thought that we process before we can go to the next thought. And that thought, very simply, is that this thought that I'm thinking at this moment either feels good and I like it and I want more of it, or it doesn't feel good and I don't like it. That is an emotion. That's all there is to an emotion. There is no emotion other than your decision that the thought that you are processing right now feels good or it doesn't feel good. And so, consequently, all of those hundreds or if not thousands of names that we have defined as emotions are not emotions, they are conditions of being that we are in. So, we are in the condition, for example, of grief. So every thought that we process is going to be processed from that condition of grief. That becomes the lens that we use to interpret our thought interpretation. A trauma differs from simply an unpleasant experience because we are unable at that moment to make that decision of either it feels good or it doesn't feel good because that thought so challenges our perception of self, our identity, that we enter, for that one thought, enter that condition of shock. When our awareness leaves the body and we can't make that decision. And so it leaves a gap in our experiences, which will remain there until such time as we go back and make the decision about that one thought. And we perceive and experience the last 30 minutes or now some period of time. But in that are dozens of thoughts that we are processing in an experience that we interpret, for example, a soldier in a firefight. You can have two soldiers side by side. They're in the same foxhole. They're experiencing exactly the same amount of assault on their survival. One of them will experience a trauma, the other one won't. The only reason that one experienced the trauma and the other one didn't is the one that experienced the trauma was in a reduced state of condition of being. And so consequently, he was unable to make that, or she was unable to make that decision about one or more of the thoughts in that experience. And so the process that I use isolates that moment, which they know. I can ask you, go to the most intense moment in that thought, and they go to it immediately because they recall it.
Yeah.
And I have them isolate that thought and then do a brief little exercise in order to make that decision of whether it feels good or doesn't feel good, and it goes away. And when they do that, there's just such a feeling immediately of overwhelming, wow, it's gone. And they're transformed from that moment on. Of course, they have a lot more work to do. I'm not saying that that's the end of it, but it takes away that seed, that nucleus for their traumatic experience.
So how do you balance all of this out? The daily work that you do has to get heavy because you're dealing with people's traumas, helping them
Mhm.
get over it and get to a better place. But you're a human being that needs to develop and evolve yourself. How do you balance all of that out every day?
You do the work on yourself.
Yeah.
Our purpose, there's no person, there's no one that has a different purpose in life. Our purpose is exactly the same, and that is to explore ourselves. Now, our mission is different. Our mission is unique to us, and I can characterize it very simply: do what you like. If you do what you like, then you're going to become proficient at what it is that you do, and that will be the mechanism for attracting the types of experiences that you need in order to be successful in fulfilling your purpose in life. And it's only when we don't allow ourselves to follow our mission, or, we will become successful in whatever it is that we like to do because we like to do it and we become proficient at it. And so it will provide us with what we need in order to live comfortably, to, make money, which is an inherent characteristic of our experience. But it is that simple. But becoming aware of what it is that I like is so difficult for most people because of pre-existing hegemonies on how they should live their life or what they should do in their life.
So let me ask you this. There's probably a lot of people out there that may exist within a vacuum and they may not know what trauma is or recognize trauma from their past. What's the best way for people to recognize that so that they can get on that path of seeking help and overcoming those traumas?
Take an assessment. Are you happy? Are you as happy as you can be? Happiness is the measure of how we're doing and the measure of where we need to go next.
So let me ask you this. If you had a dream tonight, you ran into a much younger version of you before this new career that you have now, and you could give that version of you a piece of advice based on this life you've lived collectively, what advice would you impart on that young version of you?
My undergraduate studies began in philosophy, and I deemed myself, the usual 19, 20-year-old philosopher, which is so funny when you look back upon it. But that
Yeah,
notwithstanding, I would encourage my pursuit of that rather than the decision that, gee, you can't make any money as a philosopher.
yeah,
And I would encourage myself to have pursued that because that's what I like to do
yeah.
at the time.
So, of everything that you've done and evolved into up to this point in your life, what are you ultimately the proudest of?
Uh, I'm proudest of my awareness of self and the humility that comes with that, uh, and being able to help people that are in extreme duress, or in traumas, and watching on their face that transformation as they heal so quickly.
So, the one thing about your patients is a part of the process that all of us have to, whether we're healing or evolving in our career, is risk. What's the biggest risk that you've taken in your life professionally?
To quit everything that I was doing that was conventionally successful. Had I had the trappings of being successful in that career and letting it all go.
So everyone has a perception of you, family, friends, clients, colleagues, everyone that knows you, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
I'm a messenger and a humble messenger, and I believe that I have an accurate perception of self, and my orientation is to be of service, and that guides my daily routine. How can I be of service today?
What's the best thing about living in Memphis?
Barbecue.
So is it sweet, salty? How does the Memphis barbecue? Because I know we're in a barbecue capital here in Kansas City. I'm curious.
Well, if you live in a city like Kansas City or like Memphis, then you learn to enjoy the barbecue that you have, but you also become curious about other methodologies of preparing and cooking barbecue.
Yeah,
And so you diversify your taste and your sensations. Sometimes some things you like, some things you don't like, about the different treatment of barbecue. Um, Memphis barbecue began. We actually years ago we have a festival called Memphis in May, and part of that Memphis in May festival was the International Barbecue Contest. And it began very inauspiciously. And when it really began a few years after my undergraduate studies. And the barbecue contest consisted of about a dozen different teams that set up a tent and a backyard barbecue and some lawn chairs, and we all got together and cooked whatever barbecue that we liked. And that was the beginning of the Memphis in May barbecue contest. And I participated in that for a couple of years. And we were hungover as well as exhausted from staying up all night watching the barbecue and cooking cooking the food.
yeah.
But that expanded and developed into just a tremendous enterprise. So the beginnings were really rib and dry rub barbecue. But of course, it expanded into all sorts of sauces and so forth. But my favorite is still dry rub ribs
Yeah,
that are slow cooked over a grill.
that's the way to do it. So let me ask you this, as a sports fan, if a time machine pulls up in front of your house when we get off the phone, you can go anywhere in the history of sports and see one game, where are you going to go?
1961 Yankees.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I was 10 years old at the time, and that I was into baseball, and we were playing baseball, and that was just a magnificent period for baseball, and particularly for the Yankees, and to be able to see Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris and all those guys in their heyday would be just magic for me.
Was Yogi Berra on that team? He had to have been, right?
Yeah. Oh
Okay.
yeah.
So there's a documentary on Yogi Berra that I saw recently. It's amazing. I had no idea how decorated he is. And the fact
Yeah.
that he didn't get that due respect while he was on this planet is astonishing. Like, I didn't realize he was the architect of that 69 Mets team. He went over, managed them, pulled Seaver and all those guys around, and it was because of his sage insight that they did it.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, he was really the unofficial team manager.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was only his witticisms. I mean, they talk about we would intentionally screw up just so Yogi would come out and give us one of his witticisms.
Which were genius. I mean,
Right.
could you
Yeah.
imagine being his pal every day? He would just be filling up a book of aphorisms that just would be astonishing, you know.
I watched an interview that he did not long ago, and they were talking about I don't remember it was in a World Series, and um, the guy that was pitching and Yogi was catching, and the first guy up, first pitch, he hit a home run. Second pitch, second guy hit a home run. Third pitch, third guy got a fly out and got on third base. And Yogi, was asked, what do you think of this guy? I said, well, he's thrown three pitches, and I haven't. How's he pitching today? And he said, well, he's thrown 3 pitches and I haven't caught anything, so I don't know how he's pitching
Right.
today.
That's Yogi.
Yeah.
That's so cool. That's so cool. Hey, if anyone wants to hire you, reach out. They have any questions, they're curious, any of the good business in your world, where should they go?
I have a website, the initial D, Dean Graves, all one word.org, and it has my books on there, which will be extremely helpful to people depending on what they need. Um, and they progress as I've written the books. The initial book, if you're just beginning the healing process, then I encourage the Enlightenment Plain and Simple book to deal more specifically with traumas and how you are in need of healing, then the identity models, understanding and healing stress and suffering. My compendium book is the most recent. It's available at your local bookstore as well as on Amazon. I tell you, all of these are cheaper on Amazon.
Yeah,
The Enigma of Consciousness, a spiritual exploration of humanity's relationship to consciousness.
wonderful.
And in the study that we are all undergoing, whether we're aware of it or not, is consciousness. We are consciousness. Everything that we experience is consciousness. So it is a study. Our life is a study of consciousness.
Wonderful. Dean, this has been fascinating. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your story. Best of luck with everything. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the opportunity. It's been delightful to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you.